Jon Cooke, what's going on, man?
Hey Joe, all good, mate. All good, all good.
Yeah.
Lots of interesting stuff happening at the moment.
Oh, really? I'll have to get into that. So that sounds pretty fun. Yeah, and you're enjoying the mean data streets in London. So
Yeah,
that's cool. Yeah,
absolutely.
that's right. Cool. For people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Sure, sure. So my name's Jon Cooke. I run a data and AI consultancy. Been that for about 4 or 5 years. Used to work for Databricks. Run lots of data practices and different consultancies like PwC. Been in the data space probably about 20 years. Tech space about 30 years. Doing a lot of work at the moment around data products and data mesh and kind of modern data architectures and stuff. So yeah, lots of really interesting stuff going on. So really getting into obviously large language models, how that fits into the data product world as well.
Mm,
So yeah, I'd love to get into detail around that. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff going on.
sounds like it. That's interesting too. I remember we were hanging out in London last fall, and I think it was a brilliant chat. Hopefully it's a continuation of that. But I know data products is one of the things we're talking about quite a bit. So, and I feel like data products is one of these terms that everybody uses, but I seem to get different opinions and definitions of what a data product is. What does a data product mean to you?
So for me, yeah, I've been having these conversations for probably about 12 months now. It's kind of interesting. For me, the product bit is the most interesting bit about that. We can had lots of debates about what it is, specifically what gets delivered. But for me, it's more around the process and who's the customer, what's the life cycle, what actually gets delivered. So fundamentally, solving a business use case would be the top of my list of what the process needs to do. Fundamentally, have a business customer, right, as well.
Yeah, I mean, what is that process? Let's dig into that a bit because I think what you're talking about is something I don't hear a lot about, which is the process of creating a product and how does something become a data product, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the way I think about it, you start with a business problem fundamentally. Like any product, it's like what's the problem that your key customer, key users, key engagement person actually needs to solve. So, in my mind, the products really in the data and analytics space is much more around the analytics than actually around the data. Because fundamentally, you might have a marketing team that wants to do upsell around recommendations. They might need a recommendation engine. So they would come to the DNA team and say, like, we need to actually build a recommendation engine to actually to increase our sales on our e-commerce platform, for instance. You start absolutely with the problems like, so a recommendation engine would be a product in my mind, fundamentally. So that's really kind of that's the entry point, and it's in my mind is exactly the same as the entry point for any other product that you're building internally or externally.
right. I mean, it's interesting though, right? Because I think for the longest time, the data world has sort of avoided the notion of products, and
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how I would describe it, but it certainly wasn't a product mindset in terms of a deliverable. What do you think changed?
So I think the what's happened. I've started my life in sort of the transactional side of the fence, so building out transactional systems, did a lot of work in banking, building risk systems and trading systems and that kind of stuff. And I think the software engineering discipline around on the transactional side of the world, is actually quite mature. It's been around 40, 50 years. There's lots of process around. There's lots of understanding of how things get delivered. They're not always delivered that well, but not understanding how there's kind of a coalesce of understanding around that. In the data space, that's not so much true. It's not as mature. So fundamentally, you get a lot of data teams who are kind of almost like these second-class citizens. They get stuff thrown over to them. They're running around trying to pull stuff together. They don't have as much love as given to them as the transactional side of the fence. But I think the last probably 10 years that's starting to change because the data on the data side, pipelines and data work is actually becoming much more mission critical. It's not just seen as a reporting thing I need to do, at the end of the quarter, this side of stuff, especially with Hadoop and the kind of big data revolution, 10, 15 years ago. Data pipelines became mission critical. I'm now starting to do lots of more AI. I'm doing stuff that's driving out my mission critical processes. Looking at predictive maintenance on manufacturing plants. We're looking
Mm.
at drones and all that sort of stuff. So I think the data world's been pulled much more into that kind of mission critical, that much more kind of transactional kind of mindset. But the problem is the data practices haven't been.
Mm.
So what's happened probably in the last 4 or 5 years, especially with things like the data mesh, what's the emphasis has been really so we need to make these production grade. We need to make them these robust processes. We need to make sure that they work as well as they do in the transactional side. But the maturity actually isn't there because the processes are actually slightly different, right? And it's
Right.
overlap. There's differences, but I think that's really where the push has come from. I mean, look at things like the data mesh, like data contracts and stuff. This is all around data production. And this is obviously, I think, where the confusion between data products comes in. When people talk about data products, they really mean robust data production. How do we make a robust production line to deliver data for our mission critical projects? And that's really, I think, where I say a lot of the confusion comes in.
Certainly seems to be that way. I mean, I always kind of quip that it feels like the data world is about 10 years behind, at least where software was. So we're starting to adopt, I think slowly but surely a lot of practices. In data ops, it's not really new, but it's not new as a concept, but it's new, I think, in terms of people discovering it
Yeah,
and trying to take a go at implementing it. And then, data mesh, I mean, that's I think a software, engineering first mindset applied to
yeah.
data and so forth. But
Mhm.
I mean, but it seems like as a field, we're still maybe holding on to a lot of the views of the past in some ways too. And I mean, how do you think we reconcile sort of where we need to go versus like maybe clinging on to, practices and relics that might not serve our purpose?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think one of the facets around also with data, it's I've seen the last sort of 10, 15 years is sometimes you're in the transactional world, in the software world, you're very close to the use case, the business use case. Your product
Right.
owner or your whatever comes to you and say, I've got this initiative and I need to build some software to support that. In the data world, traditionally, we've been one step removed from that because data supplies the use case, but that isn't
Mm.
actually part of that. And I think that's another thing that we need to kind of move away from a bit. And again, the data product mindset or the product mindset is pushing us towards that. And a lot of companies aren't still there. They still have data teams supplying data to their business teams to actually build their use cases. And I think that to me is the biggest shift we need to make is we're actually getting data teams not really just being data only, but actually being owning the use case. So, like the recommendation engine use case, they come to the data team. I need to build the engine. Okay, there's a whole lot of data that surrounds that, but it's actually all delivered part and parcel as the same thing, rather than one team deliver the data, another team deliver the analytics, and it's
Mm.
kind of fragmentation. I think that to me is the biggest shift I think the industry needs to make, and the data mesh is sort of pointing the way, and data contract is sort of getting there, but we need to. It's much more of an organizational kind of delivery mindset rather than a silo kind of data mindset. If you see what I mean?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's interesting. Do you think it's an education issue then, or is it training, or how would you make this organizational shift? Because this is something that I see all the time in my work and
Yeah.
either consulting or just chatting with teams or whatever, and it just seems like this is there's a lot of gravity on this one too. It seems hard.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It means changing the organization, which is always very difficult, right? Traditionally, that's really what it is, and orientating the organization around delivery streams where data is one aspect of each of the stream.
Mm.
So, and the challenge there, of course, is making sure that you've got 5 streams all delivering data, that the data is actually unified and it's controlled in the same way and all that kind of stuff, rather than 5 different kind of wild west things doing everyone doing something differently. So you've got this tension between the control and kind of oversight of governance, because data is used everywhere, which is kind of different from software. You don't get the same thing in software. You get teams delivering their own software packages, this kind of stuff.
Right.
You get some sharing around sort of service or architecture and stuff, but traditionally, the software teams deliver their software, they run it, they own it, they manage it. Whereas data gets chopped up, it gets aggregated, it gets moved around. So you've got this tension between data that needs to be used across the organization, but needs to be used by the line of business teams, but also controlled in a centralized way. So you don't have this kind of this fragmentation. So that's really the tension. That's also slightly different in the data world than it is in the sort of transactional world. So it's trying to get that. But for my mind, you've got to have the overlay of that control, but have the streams being delivered by the lines of business. You know,
So would those streams be sort of all encompassing of things like analytics, machine learning, and so forth? Or because right now what I see is a lot of data teams, quote unquote. Um, it literally is the plural version of that, right? It's teams. You have your
yeah,
data science team over here, and your analyst over here, and your data engineer sits over here, and And the other thing I noticed is it's kind of shocking that a lot of these teams, quote unquote, they don't really talk to each other that much.
Yeah.
Like they have different mandates, and so um, yeah, I think your observation is spot on. That needs to change. Like delivery stream is definitely I like that term. It's a good way of putting it. So
Absolutely. It's funny when I
yeah,
used to work when I used to work in banking. I mean, they always talk about these cottage industries of kind of analytics teams in the various different departments and what have you, you know. And yet, when a CEO or a head of risk wanted to gather stuff across different divisions, different departments, there'll be months go by and there'll be lots of negotiation between them. Say, what does that mean? And kind of you know, you've got the credit card team delivering their risk models, and then you've got their risk analytics, and you've got the retail team is like, well, they're not the same thing. How do we aggregate them? So I think in my mind that a truly agile organization would spin up streams, you know, almost up and down based on initiatives, and they'd bring people in to actually you know, deploy or deliver to those streams and then spin them down again potentially, you know. So you'd all have a similar sort of working practices. You'd have similar sort of sets of artifacts which you're reusing. You know, there's centralized artifacts like, you know, your taxonomies, your data governance, that sort of stuff. But the teams themselves will be able to spin up on initiative basis and actually be able to deliver and then shut down again and that type of stuff. So you get this real kind of fluidity, but you are still get the control on top of it. But that's actually quite a sophisticated operating model, and I've built a few of those in my time. But very few organisations are really there, especially organisations that are very siloed. I know I worked with an insurance company last year, and they had 3 separate divisions across the world, and they have different products
yeah.
fundamentally. So yeah, there's very little crossover between them. But you want the working practices to be the same, and you want, you know, when the CEO says, right, you know, what's our capital investment for these types of insurance, these underwriting processes, you know, I want to cross them all the divisions. You need them to come back and say in the same sort of language and the same sort of metric, the same sort of things. So you can actually do that. But again, that's quite a shift in terms of in the way they operate.
It's really interesting. It reminds me of something I was writing about yesterday when I was just sitting in the Denver airport, and it was so I come from like one part of my background is in lean, and so I used to there are definitely ideas like value stream mapping, and so I've been thinking about how you apply value stream mapping to data. Your delivery stream is definitely along that line where it's it's thinking about it in the context of data modeling, because we tend to model data in terms of silos, in terms of the physical implementation of it, but I think very rarely think about the holistic life cycle of kind of how data travels and is modeled, and really I think applying value stream mapping or delivery stream thinking to these processes is a bit of an interesting take that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, because it fundamentally changes the way that we view maybe the production and usage of data. Because right now it's basically like, if I'm on the analytics team, I'm just going to do analytical things, regardless of whether the output is considered or not. But the way you're describing it and the way I was writing yesterday, I think it's definitely more aligned towards, ideally, what is the value to the external customer? What are you trying to provide that, right? And then working
Yeah.
backwards from there. And so it's a bit of a mental shift, but I don't know. It's an interesting idea. The thing is, it's been used forever in a lot of places, right? This isn't like a new revelation, but I think in terms of data, maybe it's a bit newer. So
It is, and I think for me, it's the mindset shift is that kind of holistic end to end. You are a piece of the puzzle. You're not actually something completely in the. I've again worked in banking a lot, and you see these kind of very siloed parts of the organization, but they're a piece of the whole kind of the whole part of the business. In investment banking, you've got kind of the front office, and you've got people doing structuring and pricing and doing market making, and then you've got the trading, and then you've got the risk management, and you've got finance, and you've got treasury, and they're almost like companies in their own right. They do, give me all the data, and I'll do all my bits and pieces, and then I'll throw it over to the next one, and it's like, wow, all this data's just been moving. But actually, if you look at the life cycle of a trade, they're just pieces of the puzzle. And if and I think for me that's really the key differentiator to get to is look at your part of a delivery of a business process. And I think one thing we're very bad at in data is actually forgetting the business process, or not even looking at it. We look at everything's from a data perspective. It's like, well, data is only relevant within the business process. You can't divorce the two, And again, it comes back a little bit back to your data modeling piece. It's like, actually, why are we trying to model the data almost separately to the business process? The data changes and it morphs. morphs throughout the business process steps. So actually, why don't we model the data in that particular way? Rather than one holistic model, it's actually a business model with different data points at each of the steps, almost like a railway train line with
Hmm.
stations, and different passengers get on and off. But actually, I'm going from A to B, and I'm going through a number of those stations. And I think that's the way I think about data modeling, and the data product analogy really fits quite well in that, because actually you could have data products, models, metrics, that sort of different stations, and they're going to use some of the same data, but some of them are not going to use the same data. So I'm going to
Right.
model it for that particular product for that at that particular time in that particular part of the business process. I'm going to pick from a set of attributes which describe everything, all the station names, all that type of stuff. But I'm going to use different ones at different parts of the business process. And I think that's something, again, in my mind, something that gets quite a bit lost in data modeling, in the data world specifically, because we just think about things all it's from a data perspective.
When you think about things, yeah, from a physical implementation perspective too. So it's like, if you're in data, you're probably going to think about, I don't know, a star schema, right? That's the first thing that comes to mind for most people. But I think it's almost backwards. Use the notion of stations,
Mm.
for example, right? I think the
Yeah,
question that isn't asked is more of the high level question of, okay, so in our business, like, what is a station, right?
yeah,
For different stakeholders, and then you should
yeah,
probably work from
yeah,
that high level definition of the concept, and then how those rules and ideas flow through that the process that you're trying to describe, or various processes too, right? So you want
yeah,
to think of all the interdependencies. But yeah, I think it's crazy. I just don't see people talking about this enough. But everyone wants to talk about data modeling and
yeah.
data products, but it seems like we're almost approaching it backwards. Like we approach it from a data first perspective, and then try and shoehorn in or data religion onto business processes versus the other way around, right? So
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I sort of think of it's more around data assembly than rather than data modeling, because we're trying to
yeah,
assemble different bits of the data of the entire data universe at different times for different processes. And again, that to me makes sense, because if you look at again, come back to the trading analogy, when you're doing market making, you're just talking about pricing. So I want the pricing bits. So give me all the pricing attributes, and I'll publish that onto the market onto the market venue. And then I go to trading. It's like, well, I need a bit more than that. I need some of the pricing, but I also need some of the risk management. I need some of the hedging. I need some of the order, blah 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 blah. I've got these attributes. All right, okay. We've made the trade. Now we do the order management. All right, that's about the life cycle of it. That's I need some other bits around there. Then risk and finance and that sort of stuff. So really, as I say, it's almost like the data is morphing from an attribute level at different points in the process, and you're assembling, and you should be assembling just enough to make that part of the process. And I think we do have this propensity, like you said, this sort of religious aspect where I'm going to step back and like try and model the whole world as a big canonical or physical, canonical, kind of logical, physical, this type of stuff. And actually, we should just be assembling the data really for the point in time that we need it.
mm,
That kind of just-in-time assembly, rather than, and I'll talk a lot about from fabrication versus assembly. We are still in the fabrication phase in data. We're still trying to build everything from scratch and this type of stuff, rather than actually assembling components together. And the data should be really a bunch of components, really, which we should assemble at different points. And there's the same with stakeholders. Sometimes your risk officer is going to have a different set of views than your finance officer, than your head of trading, your head of sales, this type of stuff. And we're assembling those things for those people. So I think that's again quite a different mindset. It has a dynamism that you don't really get in data modeling. That's
right.
always a difficult one to do in data models, because data models are a set of assumptions you make at the time. It's almost like a static view of the world at the time you know it, and then something comes in that you from left field, and it breaks the model, because it's like, oh, I didn't think of that, and I've made all these assumptions and this kind of stuff. And I think that is something that's always a bit of a challenge in data modeling, I think.
It certainly is, yeah. And I'm trying to reconcile this too, because people like John Giles, who I consider like one of the probably one of the best data modelers on the planet.
Right.
He advocates really a kind of a pattern first approach. So meaning that there's probably nothing really new in a person's business, or in a business itself, that
Mm.
established patterns wouldn't at least like somewhat mimic. But it's yeah. So I'm trying to reconcile that versus it taking a more just in time. I hate to use the word agile, maybe a more lean approach to sort of how
Yeah.
we would do things, but
Yeah.
yeah, TBD on that. But I guess back to this data product mindset and the challenge that we talked about. One thing I remember when we were hanging out in London talking about was data mesh as well, and
Yeah.
um, I, you know, so I see a lot of companies talking about data mesh. In fact, I was talking to this giant mega corporation yesterday, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we definitely want to do data mesh." But um, are you seeing this too? Are you seeing a lot of people talking about data mesh? And if so, are you seeing these same people or companies successfully implementing it?
So we do talk about data mesh quite a bit, but I tend not to go into that conversation talking about data mesh.
Mm,
Fundamentally, for me, the entry point is around, and I've just done this with a large organization, is the data product is the unit of currency I tend to talk about. Fundamentally, it's the analytics, the types of things you want to do to support your business. Then once we get that concept over what the product is, what it's delivering, how it supports the business, then I start talking about the mesh. It's like actually there are mesh concepts that come in here, because the mesh is obviously it's a bunch of concepts, very good concepts, but but they're very technical. Or typically quite technical, So I don't tend to go in and say, "Look, we're going to build a data mesh." I come in and say, "We're
right.
going to build a data product capability," and it's a people, process, and technology piece. And the mesh tends to come much more in the technology bit, kind of what's the physical attributes of a data product? Okay, it's got to be addressable, this kind of stuff. We need to federate it across the different
Right.
lines of business, or you're multi-cloud, or you're multi-technology. This kind of that tends to be the sort of tail end of the conversation I have in terms of the journey I take people on. The first point is going in. Let's do data products. What does that mean? Oh, we're using a lake house, or we're using a data warehouse, or we're like, well, this isn't a technology point. This is actually how you servicing your business need with the
Mm,
delivery go out there, and the product mindset, and then that normally takes most of the conversation, to be honest, because it really, like you said, it's quite a shift. But then we sort of, then people say, oh yeah, it's about the data mesh. It's this is, and I said that absolutely, the data mesh points the way to that, but you need to go beyond the mesh to actually start talking about the product management, the life cycle, the product, the process, and the delivery, and the kind of the stakeholder management, all that sort of stuff. So that tends to be how I kind of frame the conversation.
that's a good way of doing it too, because the mesh essentially is the decentralized sharing of data products. But I think you
Yeah,
have to have as you say, the capability of making a data product like one product first before you're able to make many products.
yeah,
Kind of goes without saying. But it is interesting because I see companies jumping straight into it. Maybe they'll do like data sharing or something like that, and that's maybe a way of maybe it's a poor man's version of a sharing and of something. I'm not sure, but I guess against what Jamak had written, as far as she's concerned with data mesh, I don't think it
yeah.
neatly fits that idea. But at the same time, I think it's a step forward, right? At least now you're sharing data instead of siloing it, and I think that's a great step, in the right direction. So
Absolutely.
I mean, no harm
And
in
one thing the
that.
mesh has, yeah, one thing the mesh has done is it's opened up the conversation. I built something very similar to data mesh in 2014. It was a
Sick.
bunch of metric engines. Basically, I was working for a large bank across the whole operations, and they had like different teams running different parts of the business. So transaction reporting, reconciliations, settlements, that type of stuff. And they used to report across all of them, and there was like 3,000 metrics they wanted to do. And they said, let's do it on a data warehouse. There's no way you're going to be able to do all that in a data warehouse. So I built a whole architecture and a platform to actually show. We'd spin up different domain tables. So each domain would have its own table, and you'd spin up little metric engines, and you define the metrics. What's the settlement ratios, what's the transaction reporting ratios, all that type of stuff. And you can spin them up and down, and then they all talk to each other. It's complete separate pieces. So it's very mesh like, and that every domain had one big table. From a data modeling perspective. So, yeah, and then I thought this was revolutionary. I thought this is going to change the whole way we do data warehousing. Blah 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 blah. No one would have the conversation with me.
Really?
It just wasn't. It was like, wow, this is so far beyond what people were thinking about. But since obviously Zamac and the data mesh, I can have those conversations now. Fundamentally, it's one of those things about applying componentizing the data and analytics space into individual things, and not saying it's all got to go in a lake or a warehouse, this type of stuff. You can
Right.
have that sort of conversation, and that's been fantastic. You can have the product conversation, rather than 10 years ago I couldn't. It's just we're doing it in a data warehouse. And they couldn't. A lot of times that people tried looked at what they wanted to try and do that use case and completely failed, but they wouldn't even entertain the conversation. So I think that's definitely a way forward.
That's really cool. Yeah, that's awesome. You should. It's crazy how things. It moves slowly, then it moves fast, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's. I think back in the day when you did that, I mean, people were still trying to figure out uh, even the basic infrastructure pieces. Cloud was still fairly newish to most
Yeah.
people, and I'm not sure if this is you're in the cloud or not, but it seemed like there were a lot of new technologies that big data was still kind of at the forefront of people's minds. So it's like
Spark was version zero point 0.9, so Spark was barely out of the barely the paper
yeah,
stuff.
that's right. Yeah, it feels like the industry's matured in a lot of ways in the sense where we're there's still technology fixation, but I think now we're finally in the position where we're able to talk about use cases now. Whereas back in the day, I think there was just a lot of um, hype around whatever using the coolest technologies, which I mean it always is. And technicians want to do technical stuff and with the
Yeah,
coolest technologies, but it seems like the conversation, especially now with the economy where it is, the conversation's definitely pivoted a bit.
absolutely.
Speaking of pivots, so large language models. I know that's one thing you've been kind of nerding out on a bit. What are you up to with that?
So I mean, again, it's interesting. We did something very similar, obviously much lower scale. In 2016, built basically a chatbot for doing text summarization for another large bank. They had a load of documents they wanted to summarize, like what's the swap rates for this, what's the
Mm.
settlement process for that kind of stuff. And we had a very simple. We used naive Bayes, not deep learning stuff as well. So it was kind of interesting. That was again 2016. And I thought this is great. I want to be able to summarize stuff. I want to be able to ask questions, and it was great. But obviously the tech quite wasn't there back then. We had to do a lot of
Hmm.
taxonomy, manual handcrafting, and that kind of
Oh
stuff.
yeah.
Obviously now the variety of things you can do with the language models, and the amount of training and this stuff that you can do. I mean, I was looking for how to do an SSL HTTPS connection on Java yesterday, and I literally Googled. Well, I Googled before. Now I'm on ChatGPT, and it gave me the right thing. I spent an hour googling. I thought, why am I doing this? And so that kind of stuff, I think is fantastic. We are in. I mean, everyone said it. We are in an epoch, right? An absolute epoch. Game-changing event. But it's what's fascinating, I think, in the last probably month or so is just how obviously OpenAI and Meta and these had these big and Google these large language models, but now open source is now starting to overtake them. You
Hmm.
know, the models themselves are not USPs. They're fundamentally not. The data is not USB. No, the cost of training obviously was potentially an entry point. 600-700 grand to train a Chat GPT 4 or whatever. But that's now coming down. So it's actually if the models aren't, there's no IP in the models. There's no IP really in the data. Where's the actual IP? Where's the interesting piece around that? And you see what's happening in Hugging Face. They've just launched the Mosaic piece, the MBT
Yeah.
2 days ago. That's came up with OpenAI, and it's now almost as good. But yeah, it's open source, this type of stuff. So we're in this arms race, which is fascinating. We have this massively variety, a big variety of flexibility about what we can do, rather than what I did, 6-7 years ago, which was a very narrow use case. Now you've got this big, wide,
Hmm.
flexible set of use cases. And you're thinking about all the knowledge management roles, or in the world, not just tech ones, but like lawyers and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
These are all massively going to be disruptive. It's like the printing press is coming into people striving 10 years building books. It's that kind of level of event that's happening. And then the data management space, I think it's going to be massive. We're
Huge.
still talking about pipelines. We're still talking about handcrafting stuff. This is going to, I think, going to completely change. So, yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting space to watch.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to my lawyer a few weeks ago about this because we on Fridays we usually go have our we set aside some time to box and hit pads and just chat. So it's a fun time with the lawyer, but he doesn't charge me for it. He doesn't charge me for this, thankfully. But I asked him recently what are his thoughts on ChatGPT and how it's going to affect law, and he's already using it. He's using it for a lot of
Yeah,
routine stuff because it's stuff like operating agreements and just really boring kind
yeah,
of routine things. He's like, I don't want to do this. This takes a lot of time. I use chat GPT all day and it's saving him a ton of time. Right. So he can focus on more knowledge work and, the nuance of law,
yeah,
which is like, you're a lawyer for a reason, hopefully to interpret the gray areas of the law. Right. And it's,
yeah,
areas that even if chat GPT has an opinion, it's like, well, yeah, so does every other lawyer. So I get in line. So
yeah,
it's interesting to see how somebody like him, who I think is probably more forward looking, but is already adopting these technologies to streamline his workflow and probably find nuances and ways of doing law that he just never thought of. But as it pertains to knowledge workers like analysts and whatnot, I had Ryan Dolly. We did a podcast was a few weeks ago
Right.
we're talking about exactly the same thing. Where it's, it's my opinion is, for analysts who are focused on what or when type questions, very descriptive
Yep.
type questions. I mean, that's going to go away. They'll be focused more on causal type questions that hopefully add value to the business. But it'll be interesting to see, because these large language models, they are good at inferring things, right? Inferring in a very like probabilistic sense. I don't mean like the most literal
Yeah,
sense, because they're
statistically,
just,
right? Not heuristically, right?
no, they're stupid. I mean, they literally are dumb as a brick,
Yeah.
but they're very good at being convincing. So,
That's
right,
right. That's right. But
yeah,
it's the same as a human at a much lower scale. A human being reading a load of stuff and then just regurgitating it.
yeah,
That's what I've read. That type of stuff. And I
hmm
can make the call if someone asks me something that's similar. I can just go, oh, I can take that piece of information and just bend it a little bit and put it back without actually understanding it at all. And I
hmm
guess that's what the language models are about. It's statistical kind of regurgitation, isn't it? It's very good at it because it's just got the power behind it. Because it's got loads of data. It's but it's interesting if you look at the enterprises. Actually, the data sets there aren't huge. So what's kind of interesting? I haven't really seen any large organisations apart from people like Bloomberg who've got a massive amount of data can actually
right.
train these things. Because training language models takes huge amounts of data, right? Absolutely
Well,
huge.
that's
So.
and it's interesting too. I mean, as hanging out with Bill Inman the other day, and he always harps on text as being, sort of the future of data. In fact, when I was at this meetup and somebody asked, wanting to get into the field of data and asked for some opinions, and Bill told this person to get into text. I think Bill's been thinking about text for a
Mm,
really long time, maybe not from the angle
right.
of large language models, but it is interesting because it does kind of beg the question in terms of what corporate data is usable, right? Because as you point out, if you look at the structured data in most businesses and databases, it's laughably low for the
Mm,
most part.
yeah.
Um, still not sure if large language models have moved into structured data or not. I think it's only a matter of like a couple hours before somebody does this, if it hasn't happened. But yeah, I
Absolutely.
mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, because there's a kind of a notion of like a small language model too. That's
So
um,
I've been using that term. I've literally been using that term
oh
for the
no
last,
shit.
last couple of months. Yeah, yeah. This kind of small language. Because again, what we did for this bank, it was 1,500 documents, so it was like a very small, v small language model. And I think that's absolutely right. But I think in order to use the most enterprise data in this point, you have to kind of use the language, the inference piece of the language, or based on the models what they're using. But then you've got to obviously prompt it, and obviously where prompt engineering comes in, right? So it's about using that. It's almost like a cross training kind of piece, isn't it? Really, like
Yeah.
a dynamic cross training. So that's really where I think it's going to be really useful. I mean, we're looking to do it on our platform around just calling the APIs. So not just calling, not just looking at historical data, but actually calling out a forecasting model, for instance, that actually
Oh,
gives you future predictions. So that's what we're looking at the moment to actually,
that's cool.
and with the Hugging Face in the MBT model, that has 65,000 kind of input tokens. You can actually put almost all your APIs of your data products with with the semantic layer on top of it, saying this is the forecast is this and blah 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 blah.
hmm
And then you can give it an instruction, and then you start asking the language model for things, and then it just tokenizes stuff. So actually you've got this kind of interesting two-stage process or multi-stage process if you're using things like LangChain and stuff.
Yeah.
Where actually you're using the really all it's doing is the NLP bit, really. And then you're then mapping that onto your enterprise data. Fundamentally. So that I think is a really, really powerful kind of mechanism to actually start using small amounts of data, but using the base training data to give you that kind of natural language processing acceleration, if you like.
Interesting. You mentioned data pipelines too, and how things might be changing on the maybe on the infrastructure end. What are your thoughts? Like, what do you think changes?
So, I mean, if you look at lots of data pipelines in large organizations, right, they're complicated. They do lots of many hops, and they're mainly there because of legacy IT infrastructure, right? Or not there. The complexity is there because of the legacy. I need to
Yeah.
go this system, this system, this system, this system, because that's the way our, I'm following it's the slow train rather than the fast train, right? you know,
Sometimes
um,
very slow too. Yeah.
yeah, exactly right. And there's lots of hops. Oh, we've got this legacy estate with mainframes and this stuff, and we have to data's copy from here to here. And I tried to get it from the source system, but I couldn't because I had to get it from this system. But it's merged. It's transformed it in some way. So I've got to do all these other things. I was always embedded data quality rules I've got to unpick and this kind of stuff. So it's really, a lot of the complexity in pipelines in large organizations is trying to battle the estate rather than actually to generate the business value. Now, the thing about language models is obviously it centralizes everything, right? You bring everything in, and you put lots of training data on top of it and that kind of stuff. And suddenly you're thinking, actually, you're actually almost achieving the visions that data lakes were supposed to have done 10 years ago.
Right.
Get everything in one place, and suddenly, everything will be great because I've got access to all my data and this kind of stuff. But the problem with lakes is you've got to do all that kind of munging into a unified form that everyone can understand and make sure all the levels, the aggregation's the same stuff. And with language models, the deep learning is doing a lot of that for you. Fundamentally, it's not people doing transformations and building semantic layers and stuff. It's actually doing statistical inference around, actually that term actually probably means that. So actually you're condensing down that piece. So you actually start thinking about, if I can do that with my enterprise data into the language model, actually I can actually start using the language model as almost the entry point rather than all this complexity around copying data between the different things and trying to understand. But actually, also you're going back to you'll tend to go back to the source of that because you don't, if your language model is hitting a copied data that's been transformed, you're going to get the wrong answers, right? So actually, it's forcing, probably will force people to actually think, we can get stuff out of the source system a lot more. So you're going to shorten the lineage, you're going to shorten the pipelines, and you're not having to do all this kind of complex semantic modeling between the two things. So actually it will make that whole process a lot, well, I would say easier. I think it's going to be easy, but it's certainly going to be a lot more doable, a lot more kind of for the organization to be able to achieve that.
Yeah, that's something I've been I thought I'd be done with this book by now on data modeling. Then large language models happened.
Yes.
I've been having a lot of similar thoughts where it's, I think on one hand, I think it's still useful to expose people to the various ways of modeling throughout the life cycle, especially upstream where it matters the most. Because if you can get that right, everything works. If you can't get it right, nothing works. Then you have a bunch of bandages and, as you point out, pipelines that, and processes have to, fix it. But I think it's interesting because more than ever now, it's going to be incumbent upon the teams creating the source data and are responsible for it to get it right. Because if you can't get it right there, your large language model is only going to basically spit back, equivalently wrong or substandard results. But you're absolutely right though, because and again, it goes back to that podcast with Ryan too, where it's kind of like, so what's the if you can sit a language model on top of the data sources, I guess that changes the entire way that we do quote data right now. And so it's one where I've had sort of I told some friends I'd have to basically sit back and sort of question the entire purpose of the data industry actually, and like what is it that we're doing in light of these fairly intelligent systems. I'll call them intelligent, even though I called them stupid a second ago. They are intelligent in their own stupid way. So it's fascinating because I mean, if several months ago we didn't even I mean, I saw GPT-3 when it came out, in 2020, and that was cool to see, and you kind of get the idea of the potential. But ChatGPT just blew the door open, and because for the longest time it's kind of, is this thing going to go anywhere? Or but then it did the iPhone moment when ChatGPT was released, and now everyone's using it. So
that's right. I mean, think about it. Exactly right. I mean, same iPhones, tablets. The iPhones weren't the first smartphones. The iPads weren't the first tablets. But they couldn't get it to work in a way that was consumable, right? And this is what obviously the power that OpenAI and ChatGPT's come and do that. But interestingly enough, look at the CEO. He's saying actually there's the law of diminishing returns of the language models, right? Yeah. So it's what they've done is they've thrown a lot of horsepower at it, and it's actually produced this kind of massively flexible, largely okay, largely accurate, but accurate enough, shall we say, outcome. But actually, and I'd made a prediction a month or two ago. Actually, I think the future is actually not going to be in the large language. It's going to be much more in the small targeted language models, fundamentally. With the deep domain stuff, and that's something we found at this bank. It was like, very deep domain stuff. So if you go into kind of deep medical, kind of taxonomies or deep, stuff that doesn't have a lot of data out there, fundamentally, or something that's very specific to, when you go into defense or something like that, that's all. There's not a lot of open data around that, but you start using the same sort of techniques, and you start using this kind of, this association of inference, into the language like we talked about. Actually, you get what you'll end up is effectively a bunch of kind of base commoditized large language models that are used for everything, and we're not going to pay for them for much longer, I don't think. But actually, you start getting some much more targeted use cases and model sectors where you'll have these smaller language models, which actually, target the specific use cases around that.
Yeah.
But use the large language model as a kind of a base piece of that.
Well, it goes back to the again, those data model patterns that we were talking about earlier, right? And I think there's sort of an equivalency. Because again, unless you're operating your business in some radically different way than an established pattern. I mean, there are established a retail business, right? There's no notion of a customer, an order, a product, returns and stuff, and and it was there was a book that was actually came out in the late 90s or early 2000s that was a 3-volume set on data modeling patterns. Each one's like 500 pages, but what it did though, and I read through some of these, and it was like, crap. I mean, a lot of the blueprints have been here for a couple decades now, and so, but I think the equivalent thing, as you're pointing out, is going to happen where there's a few established rules and parameters and so forth. Not parameters in the deep learning sense, but just parameters in terms of guardrails and because you don't want to, an oil business is different than a bank, for example. Like you don't want to have the same parameters. But what do you think this does to knowledge workers, though? Who and kind of getting back to the data scientists and data analysts, for example, in terms of making data products, like how does this change things?
So we've also got to think about, like us influencers, people who do content creation, all that sort of stuff. What I'm hoping, and again, it's a hope rather than a true prediction, actually, there'll be much more focus on creativity rather than actual, because a lot of the stuff you see, is content you see is commoditized, right? Fundamentally, and I think that, to me, and again, it's like you go to the printing press kind of analogy where, before that, people would spend 10 years crafting these very ornate books, and they're very pretty and that kind of stuff. But the actual content in them wasn't a lot. But actually, now I've got the printing press, I can do all sorts of more interesting things. I can fabricate more things. I can actually deliver, flyers. I can do pictures. I can do all sorts of things. So I think what's going to happen is effectively the content, the knowledge workers will become less about the kind of diagnostic, analytics, commoditized stuff, but much more about creativity. I'm hoping that's what will happen. We'll shift, and we'll get a lot more creative things. We'll start seeing things that we've never seen before, because actually the mind, the power is going on creating new things rather than just putting spins on existing concepts, that kind of stuff. Because all that stuff will be much more commoditized.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Again, I think it's, if you and I do consulting, and we see a lot of things, and it seems like you ever learned to play a song on the piano?
Or very badly, yes,
very badly, right? But it's kind of like, and a friend of mine described this as you always, most people are still stuck at like the first 2 bars of a song, right? And that kind of feels like where we are as a data profession, where it's you get the data team in, they do stuff, but it tends to be kind of a repeat, and you don't get that far in the process, because again, you're stuck at the first 2 bars versus like creating an entire song and playing it end to end. And it just seems like for some reason we can't get past certain points. So hopefully it just forces the issue. To your point, there's a lot of I think there's a lot of ceremony in terms of kind of how people practice quote data, because everyone sees what everyone else is doing, right? And so it's like, well, that's an acceptably I guess okay level or standard to operate by, so I'll just do that because that's what these other teams are doing, right? And you may aspire to read like Netflix's blog or Uber's blog about how they're doing data, and then and so forth. So
but also there's still a lot of, I think the other thing as you see about data teams, and it's not just data tech teams that are the same, there's a lot of kind of appetite to solve the technical problems and not the business problems. Technical problems are easier because they're well structured, they're formed, that kind of stuff. That's why we still have these endless debates about different file formats like Iceberg with its hoodie and all this kind of stuff. Actually, the important bits to solve are the hardest, but are the business problems, because actually you've got to go and talk to the business, and sometimes the business don't know how to articulate and don't know how to do it. So it's much more sort of left brain, right brain type thinking, and I think that's something we're trying to change on the with our process from the data product pyramid. For me, it's about building and iterating products with the business in real time. So we go to the business person, say, what decision you want to make? Oh, we want to upsell new customers. All right. So we think we need to build a forecasting model around that. Or in order to do that, we need to understand kind of what customers are buying. So we need to build a little model like that. So what we're delivering is effectively a process which you can actually use real data to actually iterate in real time with the business. Go, right, I'll just go away and build that model. All right, what do you think about this? Is this right? Oh, actually, that's not what's happening there. Oh, we're losing all these customers on the back of this. Oh, right, so let's go on this tangent and let's iterate around that to understand your business. That's where the data world needs to get to.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, but we're not spending all our time building pipelines and building lots of hardened infrastructure. It's that ideation, that iteration with the data, getting access to the data to be able to do that with the business. So not only to find out problems, but also to work out new things to do. Right? The business will say, "What we want to launch this product in Southeast Asia. We haven't done that before. How do we do this?" Now today,
Yeah.
most companies would struggle to do that. They'd come up with a hypothesis. They'd probably hire a management consultancy. They're probably doing spend 6 months, when actually what you want to do is let's go and find some target customers in there. Let's get the data together. Let's put a little prototype product together. Let's put some analytics together and let's go and test it. And we're not able to do that in a few weeks. That is just such a beyond, capability for lots of organizations. But that really, and that's where I'm hoping that the whole large language models and this kind of stuff enables us to get to the point, because that's what businesses really need. They don't want, they don't need large, complex pipelines and this kind of stuff. They need an ability to be able to ideate, iterate, and measure and test, and then pivot. I call the the OODA loop.
Yeah.
The pilot. I talk a lot about that. That to me is what the data strategy should be. There's only one data strategy, and it's doing that. Getting your
Yeah.
business to do that. That to me is the holy grail.
And if you need large pipelines, you have a reason for it, right? Because it's
Yeah.
just built into the goal. Yeah, I wrote an article about this about a month ago, where I think it's called "Business Doesn't Care About Data."
Yeah.
It's absolutely true. So, I mean, the whole, call to arms was, as a profession, if we could stop, leading the discussion with the word data and said, as you're pointing out, focus on the problem. Which, back in the day, I mean, you've been in the game for a bit, but when I got started in this field, it was, I was just embedded focusing on sales, marketing, and supply chain problems. Like that was what I was supposed to do. I don't think it was a data position. It was just, you're smart, help us figure these out kind of things.
Yeah.
Right. So whatever it took, but I don't think I ever like led with the word data. It was always, it was a consequence. It was maybe a way that I solve problems, but it wasn't like, let's use data to solve your problem. It seems like but again, we talked about this ad nauseum in this chat, but it's like I think we're doing it backwards as an industry. So
Yeah, it is exactly right. I mean, I did it on the post the other day. So I often get brought in to do some technology and end up speaking to the CEO and line of business about how the business works, because I want to build this, and this. Like, well, okay, in order to build that, what's the flow? What's the business process here? Oh, well, we haven't worked that bit out. All right, let me sit here, let's workshop it. Let's draw up the diet. Oh, these bits missing. Oh, have you spoken? What's your customer look like? How are you going to pay for that? Where's that going to come from? And lots of head scratching goes on. It's just like that happens to me a lot. I go into and this is the challenge. And I need to do something. The first thing I need to do is build something. It's like now, if you take the kind of the startup world or the UX world, the first thing you do is market research, identify your customer, try something out cheaply, quickly, and easily. That's what you need to do. And very very few organizations are very good at that. And data and analytics, or analytics more than data, needs to drive that whole process. In my mind, that's the shift we need to make. But it's a mindset shift, not from just the data team, but the business teams in there as well, because there's lots of barriers to businesses doing that. There's corporate politics. There's it's hard. You've got to be agile and stuff. You've got to change the whole way you operate and this kind of stuff. So it's almost putting the too hard basket, especially if the company's like 100, 200 years old. It's the way we've always done it and this type of stuff. But it's really the mindset shift we need to make, I think.
I agree. Well, I guess our future is just basically being management consultants then. So
Yeah, indeed.
yeah, it's awesome. Well, cool. It's been a great chat. Love talking to you. I'll be in London in September for Big Data London, so we'll have to
Good day,
hang out.
London. Yes,
Yeah.
that'd be fantastic. Yeah,
Yeah. So it'd be cool to hang out again on the mean data streets.
that's
So
right. Yes.
as Chris Tab calls them. So
Yeah, indeed.
yeah, it's awesome. So yeah, thanks, John, for being on the show. For people who want to learn more about you, how can they do that?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's been great to be on. So LinkedIn, Jon Cooke, Dataception, or Jon Cooke at dataception.com, email. Those are probably the best way to contact me. So yeah, thanks a lot, Joe. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, anytime, dude. All right, cool. All right. Talk to you soon, man. See ya.
Cheers.